is it saying here? Live. I think we are live. Let me see. You would think it would be more obvious in the interface. So anyway, boomer moment. We'll see.
I see it on your page.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so we are live. All right. Well, pardon the noobishness, everyone that ends up watching this, but yeah, it's really weird. Before, when I did this, OBS let me know I was live with a useful icon, and that's not there anymore. But hey, it's working. So anyway. So today's live stream, I'm going to try to keep it pretty short. It's just pixel art feedback for a screen or two of a very nice looking RPG, like JRPG style game that's in development. By the way, everyone, I have someone with me. The other voice you'll be hearing is my friend Mike. And so yes, we're both named Mike, but we're fellow. Yep, fellow Amiga, classic Amiga computer aficionados. Both have similar interests in game development and things like that. And we've done live streams in the past on Twitch, which are now hosted on this YouTube channel if you want to go watch those older live streams. But anyway, so this is the game, if you can see it. Is it showing up yet on the web page that says Stoneshard? Is it showing up yet on the stream, Mike?
It is. I see it. It's beautiful.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, it's looking really good. I just watched the teaser video, and that looks good. Here's some examples of screenshots. To my knowledge, it's still a work in progress, but it's looking good. And so anyway, so I belong to a pixel art page on Facebook, and one of the team members posted a screenshot, and it was an excellent opportunity to discuss some very common sort of art directing sorts of things that can be done to this sort of approach, method of thinking about some specific aspects of a video game and video game scenes or screens that can help improve the quality. So I'm going to go into promotion here. And hold on again, sorry about the brief interruption, just keeping track of things, making sure it's all working. It seems to be. Alrighty. Alright, so can you see the screen yet, the actual pixel art?
I can, yes.
Okay, so this is the screen that I first saw, that I immediately thought, wow, this would be an excellent screen to give some feedback on. So I got the team's permission, and they did want me to mention, or they did mention to me, that it's still a work in progress, and this particular scene has no, it's not yet lit. And what they mean by that, it's not necessarily hand painting lighting into the pixel art in the game's engine. We can probably find it in some screenshots, hopefully. If not, I could play the videos. Oh, you could see there's a campfire here, and you can see the torches on the walls. They actually radiate like an alpha blended light source,
Right.
like in additive mode or something. So yeah, so I think that's what they meant when they said this scene is not lit. So however, either way, even if you're going to have sort of programmatically made or like special effect style lighting in a scene, there's still an overall lighting that's sort of built into the artwork. So
Sure.
that's the thing that I'm going to give some feedback and some suggestions on, as well as just some design decisions, which I think can really help situations like this. And so obviously, one thing I've said in a lot of videos in the past is that video games, obviously, as the name implies, they are very visual. And when an artist is making art for a video game, it's really important to not just focus purely on that one thing you're drawing at the moment. You really have to think about not only whole scenes and how a whole screen of your game works together, but also make sure that you're communicating to the player. So there's not just how pretty is it, it's how clearly you're communicating to the player at every moment, what you can interact with, what is dangerous, what is not dangerous, what is, what tiles or what part of the environment you can walk right through, and what is a barrier such as a wall or something like that. So, or a platform if you're working in a 2D platformer game. So one of the things that I thought could use improvement in this particular environment for this game is a more spread out range of value. Value is how light or dark something is. And if you look at this scene, almost everything, the very large majority of things are medium tone. So you see like dark details, but then except for like the highlights on metallic things or the character's skin, almost everything else is medium tone and dark. And so even when you have things like, oh yes, this is like a log cabin, everything is wood, you can still have, obviously there's very pale woods, there's very dark woods, there's very rich woods, like cherry, sort of burgundy or mahogany colors. So, like this particular scene would benefit a lot, in my opinion, having a broader range of values with particular things to help separate things from each other, but in a cohesive way. In other words, we should not be distracted by specific floorboards. The fact that a particular floorboard exists, we should be able to infer that by looking at the art, but every floorboard should not be fighting for your attention with strong outlining and detailing. It should just be a floor, a nice wooden floor, and then other than that, it should not distract. Same thing with walls and things like that. So that's one of the ways that I'm going to make some suggested edits. And the other thing is contrasting sort of textural direction. So if you look at this screen here, the overwhelming majority of textures are creating horizontal lines. Can you see that? The floorboards are going horizontally. The walls, the stone wall, the what might be log walls. The vast majority of stuff is going horizontally, and that's actually interesting. One of the reasons the barrels show up nicely, despite being very similar colors to the wall they're against, is because their textural lines are going vertically and then diagonally, which is a nice change from virtually everything else on this particular screen.
I see that. Actually, I noticed that, to me, on the right-hand side, the wall, the foreground wall, it's hard to tell the difference between that and the floor behind it, like without...
Right. Well, actually,
it looks like it's the same.
Right. What's happening here, actually, is that in the game engine, they make those walls, they're like 50% transparent.
Oh, okay.
So and that's another artifact or something about the game engine that he basically gave me a screen grab from the game and not direct art assets. But one of the things I'm going to do, which I guess I might as well do now, is I'm just going to pick the background black color, and to be safe, I'm just going to remove these two walls. And the reason I'm doing this is those were generating lots of extra colors, as you can see here. Like one of the things the artist mentioned to me is that he basically wanted me to keep in mind while giving feedback that they're working within a limited number of colors. So in order to get back to seeing what that actual limit is or something much closer, we have to remove the parts of the image that are generating lots of additional colors. And then what I can do is I can go into color, reduce, let's see, remove unused colors, and then compact. And then you can see that got rid of quite a few, like 2/3 of the colors that were being used. How's the video doing on the stream? Is it keeping up relatively well with my voice?
It just showed the color reduction, so I see
okay.
how impacted. So we're about, what, 10 seconds, 5 or 10 seconds behind.
Okay.
Not bad.
All right, good. And it sounds like the construction might start back up again. My apologies to everyone if that becomes annoying. You should still be able to hear me, but it might be annoying. All right, there it is. Can you hear that sawing?
Yeah, I can hear that.
Okay. Annoying?
No, probably more annoying for you. But
yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so anyway, so here's one of the things that I was going to say, and in fact, I probably, to do this like sort of quick and dirty, we'll load this into Photoshop so I can, do some like gradient overlays a little more easily than I can in a direct indexed color mode graphics program. But this program, ProMotion NG, is the one I've been using, or variants of it I've been using for well over a decade. It's fantastic, specifically for pixel art and sprite animation. But anyway, so I guess I will save this, and then we'll load it into Photoshop. There it is. And hopefully using all these programs won't slow down the stream. All right. Okay. So the other thing, not only is everything, or the vast majority of stuff, are horizontal textures, the other thing that I noticed is when you look at the stone wall for the chimney, and then the sort of log divided walls. I assume that's supposed to be logs. It's a little hard to tell. And then the wooden floor. Everything's relatively the same size, like every horizontal segment. Like you could see between the stone wall and the floor, it's very, very similar. But anyway, so I'm going to switch into RGB color mode so I can work with all of the tools at my disposal here. And I'm just going to take the time to quickly delineate the floor itself. And this won't be perfect, but actually I should... Oh good, anti-aliasing is turned off. It's almost like a pixel artist used this install of Photoshop before. We don't want the fuzzy edges, since we're working with pixel art. Okay, so that's a door. So I'm just adding to the selection, and I'm going to try to just, as quickly as I can, just separate out the wall from everything, the floor from everything else. Because once we have it broken up into layers dedicated to specific aspects of the image, I think that's a piece of a table. I'll fix that later. Alright, and yeah, this is supposed to be like a bookshelf or a table corner over here. And then we'll grab the other rooms as well. I'll even do the shadow cast by the table. Oh, and there's a windstorm outside. Can you hear the wind? Is the mic picking up the wind as well?
Yeah, I did hear that. That's funny.
Wow. Yeah. Well, at least the microphone is sensitive, but it's a little too sensitive for background noise. I wonder if there's a setting I can... Like I said, I'm a complete noob at this stuff, so my apologies, everyone, if the background noise gets annoying. Okay, so now I have everything but the floor, I think. Let's see. On its own. What is it doing? Wake up, Photoshop. What are you doing to me? All right. Hide that. Okay, so it's just the floor. Okay. So now what I can do is layer. We can even do an adjustment layer for things like brightness and contrast, and affect that. Oh, that's affecting everything. I didn't want that. All right, I'll just do it the dirty way. Let's see. Duplicate layer. So we'll keep the original, and then we will image adjustments, brightness, contrast. All right, now we're just affecting the floor, and you can see just by brightening it, now we're really getting some nice separation.
Oh yeah.
Between the walls and everything else. And then obviously, nice. Yeah. And then, so what we can do at that point also, if we want to, like it feels like this is supposed to be a very humble environment, so the floor is not going to be freshly varnished and stuff like that. There would probably be a lot of signs of wear, especially if this is supposed to be in like a basement type situation, although I don't think it is because there's a flight of stairs going down. And I can't tell if these are supposed to be windows or not. If so, then I guess it's nighttime, but there's some detailing here that makes me question if those are windows. But I think they're supposed to be windows. But anyway, so I'm not positive what the exact environment is. But regardless, even if the lighting is supposed to be dim, and then a fun thing we can do as well is play with the opacity of this adjusted layer, so we could bring ourselves all the way back to the original and then just start nudging it upward to get the level of separation we want. So the artist, the art director, game designer can decide what works best, but the important things, just at a glance, this just makes it more pleasant and much easier to see where you can walk and where you cannot walk, where the walls are and things like that. So we'll just
definitely
leave
adds more depth.
Yeah, exactly, and just more pleasant contrast. It communicates better to the player. Things are less murky this way, less kind of muddy, and then. The other thing too that I had started mentioning before with these floorboards is it's very unlikely that you really need to have any really bright highlights or really dark. Why did that happen? Oh, the opacity, that's right. Okay, I just merged those two layers down to each other to make sure it's all opaque so I can edit it more easily. But anyway, the point is, as you can see, it's got some quite dark darks and it had some very light lights. And if we kill the contrast of the floor, because the floor should be there to provide a rich environment and stuff, but it should not distract. So that using this color for just plain detailing in the floor is probably not a good idea, unless you're going for the very occasional little detail like a knot in the wood grain.
Sure.
But let's see, zoom back in. So you can see this area I've been playing with. You could see, even though I brightened it, like the contrast here is really strong. And that's one of the ways that you communicate as a video game artist is, this is there for environment, it's pretty, but it's not, or foreboding, it sets the atmosphere, but you want its contrast lower. You want it to just be, you just sort of want to see the whole thing and go, floor, that's the floor, right? You don't want, like I said, every floorboard screaming for attention having the same level of contrast as actually relevant things like walls that you can walk into, doors that you can open, items that you can pick up, or traps that'll kill you. So that's my suggestion, is two things. Overall, just pick a general tone for the different aspects of the environment and make sure that as much as possible, and to the aesthetic taste of the design team, make sure that there's nice separation of things, that at a glance you can really tell things apart from each other. And it seems like I've looked at other, and this could be completely wrong, this could be the intended art direction of the game, it could be because They really want the sort of programmatically special effect lighting to sort of be the focal point of lighting, that they intentionally made things muted. But there's also, like, this could be completely not the reality. My stomach just grumbled. I wonder if that's going to, I wonder if the mic picked that up. But so, okay, here's the artist's Twitter page, or just a screenshot from it. And almost every bit of pixel art that he was showing off on the page, do you notice something in common with all of them? And I'm not talking about like contrast or brightness. I'm talking about what's the same with all of them. And that might be hard to guess without knowing what's going on in my mind. But notice the background color for all of these is, if not black, nearly pitch black. Right. So if an artist has a habit of creating the individual art pieces on top of a black background, then that's going to set the entire tone for all of the graphics they make. Because when they do any particular thing against a black background, it's going to appear much brighter and to have much sharper contrast than it actually has. You know how everything, like if you're working with reds or warm colors, if the background is green, the opposite color, then your reds are going to seem much more vibrant. Like, that's a trick. Like, if you really want to emphasize the reds and oranges in your image, then you make the background or other things the opposite colors. So you can play with the contrast of like hue or color, or contrast of brightness and darkness and things like that. So I have a feeling this artist has a habit of developing their graphics against either pitch black or very dark background, and that's like having an overall effect on everything, including the final fully assembled game screens. And like I said, I could be wrong, but that's the impression I get both from the screenshots of the game that I've seen and the Twitter page. And as you can see, it's beautiful stuff. So don't get me wrong. And this purely might be a matter of taste, and this might be absolutely a wrong impression that I'm getting. But it's something to keep an eye out for. In general, unless you know for a fact that your game is going to be overwhelmingly dark intentionally, you usually want to work on a relatively neutral, medium grayish background color. And that way you're going to get a much better feeling for how the art you're working on is going to look in general in any environment.
Interesting.
So yeah, so there's that. And then, so the other thing that I was going to suggest, now, I mean, just creating that additional separation of the floor by lightening it compared to everything else, which is still medium tone. Now what we've done, not only have we separated it much better from everything else, but now it actually opened us up. Now we can actually feel how much range we have even between that now brightened floor and everything else. So before, everything felt really the same, and psychologically you feel constricted. You feel like there's not actually a big range of values possible. And now, just because I added something that's clearly brighter than the walls and everything else, now I know I can look and I can say, you know what? Like this stone wall here. So I'm just going to really quickly isolate that and copy it from this layer, paste it down. So suddenly I can tell there's definitely a value, which value is lightness and darkness. There's a value in between the floor and that dark wall. So why don't we make the stone wall use that in between value, right? So now that I isolated that in its own layer, I can just go image adjustment. Either brightness, contrast, or hue saturation will let me change how light or dark it is also. But a lot of times, so you can see, like here I go, right? So something like this, it's darker than the floor, but lighter than the wall, right?
Yeah.
So now things are just starting to really have their own personality, so to speak, show up better, and yeah. So And then the other thing that, while we're at this, I might as well bring up this point. I mentioned I was going to add some gradient overlays. Is I can't think of, I might be messing up the pronunciation of this word. It's Italian. Chiaroscuro shading, something like that. I've known that word for my whole life now. I can't remember exactly what it is, but the idea of shading not based on a specific light source, but basically pretending that the farther away from the viewer, the darker it is, and the closer to the viewer, the more lit it is, right? So, so what we're going to do, because of this, the interesting thing about this kind of it's not exactly isometric, but it's related to isometric perspective in the way that we're sort of simulating a 3D perspective without a vanishing point, right? So the point is we can sort of see the tops of things and their front at the same time. So it's not perfect side view. It's certainly not perfect top view. We're seeing both at the same time, but it's not real perspective because there's no vanishing points. So one of the ways that we can reinforce this sense of three-dimensionality is with the shading, and to apply this shading with I can't remember the pronunciation, I can't remember the exact word. But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into blending options, and I'm going to do a gradient overlay, and I'm going to change that overlay mode to something like multiply. And do you see that? Like, it's too extreme right now. But do you see how making the shading on that wall go from dark at the base to light as it gets up higher and closer to the viewer? It's giving it a better three-dimensional sense. And that also obviously is going to really help separate like the player from it if the player went over the wall. So, and again, you can just, once you do it, you can play with the opacity of this blending mode and get it. Oops, yeah, it's an annoying issue with Photoshop. This window will disappear on its own sometimes. But anyway, so I hope that makes sense. So we'll just leave it at that because it's being annoying. Click OK. And then, so now I'm going to very quickly cut out this player sprite just so we can see how he looks against that wall. All right, I missed a couple of pixels over here of his forehead. And bring him up in front of everything else. And there we go. So you see how nicely he pops from that wall? And if we
can catch up here.
Yeah, oh, that's right. Yeah, I forget about the delay. So, all right, and then now I just hid the layer. So if you wait a couple seconds, you'll see that he doesn't pop out anywhere near as much, and there's not as nice a feeling of sort of three-dimensionality. So now I'm turning it back on again, so you can see the difference. And I'm cheating right now using the 24-bit Photoshop stuff and gradient overlays and stuff like this. But this can translate very, very well, even with the limited palette range of the original graphics. So the artist just has to be careful which colors in the range they're using more of in their own range. So let's say they have 4 or 5 shades of gray going from black to light gray for the stone wall. For the stone walls at the bottom, you're only using like the darkest 2 colors a lot, and then like 1 slightly brighter color for the extreme highlights of those bricks. And then as you go up, you're just using more of a specific sort of like you're shifting which 2 colors you're using the majority of in that range as you go up, and making sure you don't use any of the brightest highlight color in your darkest bricks, and you don't use any of the darkest color in your brightest bricks. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it would look very, very similar even if I were only using the colors that are definitely available in their current color palette. But anyway, so I'm going to save this. in case there's a crash or anything, I don't lose my work. So yeah, so so far we've expanded the range of values we're using for specific things. We're remembering it's a very good idea to communicate as a whole in a scene, make it really clear what is there just for setting the mood and what is there that you can actually interact with, and make sure that the things you can actually interact with are using more vivid colors in general, sharper contrast, stronger outlining if you're going to have outlining in the game, in the style of art. And then another thing to keep in mind is it's a really good idea when you're rendering something, even if it's made out of separate components, like I mentioned with the floor, and I said it would be a good idea to reduce the contrast in the floor so you're not using almost black lines for the seams in between each board of the floor. You're establishing the overall feel of a floor made out of boards, but you're not drawing extreme attention to every last board and where they separate, right? So there's a very similar thing going on to the barrels, which I mentioned before. The barrels are nice, and they have nice contrast, and they stand out well because they are not horizontal. They're one of the few things that are not overwhelmingly horizontal in their texture lines. But there is definitely some way that they can be two important ways that they can be improved. The most important is from sort of an anatomical standpoint. And that's the fact that the way, and this is one of the problems that you can run into when you're thinking of an object as its individual components instead of as the whole, right? So you'll see this when artists are, especially young guys that are getting into like comic book art and stuff like that, especially American style, where everyone's like all the men are like very ripped, very muscular, very, you know what I mean? And so
yes.
when artists start learning anatomy, they go overboard and they over delineate. Everyone almost looks like a negative 5% body fat, like kind of like very muscular mummy. There's paper thin skin and no body fat at all. And they're actually hurting their art because they are thinking there's this muscle and it connects to this muscle and stuff like that. You're supposed to keep that knowledge, but use it mostly while you're applying your shading so you can hint at what's beneath, but not over delineate every part of the anatomy. And ironically, or interestingly, this is the same thing that's happening with the barrel. The barrel has slats of wood going vertically, in this case because they're lying on their side, and then they've got metal bands. But the problem is, the metal bands are so exaggerated for two reasons. Because the artist really wanted it to be clear that these metal bands exist on their own, so to speak. He brought them all the way around down to the sides here, and it's 1 pixel thin, so he thought, well, I can't get any thinner than that, right? But that causes the metal bands to look like metal bars that are bent around. They're too thick, right? That metal band is very, very thin metal, and it's there like a belt, literally a belt to keep the wood slats together. So removing that, I went too far because this is just an extreme shadow. But you can see, as soon as you go all the way down here, you're starting to get that it's too thick effect.
Right.
So there's two things going on. There's the don't go all the way down to the sides. And then, like I said, this probably gets too thick, so you can't tell where the barrel actually ends. So I wouldn't get so dark. Let the sort of shape and bulge of the barrel remain. If you're going to see the metal part that brightly, then you should be able to see the wood as well. So this isn't going to be perfect, but hopefully it'll get the idea across. And then the other big thing is make sure, even though things, which is a good thing to keep in mind, have you ever heard the term before? It's used a lot in 3D rendering, specularity or specular. Yes, okay, so like that basically, in a general nutshell, I'm talking about how different materials reflect light differently. And the shinier something is, like metal or glass or something, the more confined a bright reflection or highlight will be and the brighter that reflection will be. So the artist definitely kept that in mind, highlighting the metal, making it look shinier than the wood, which overall is fairly dull in this case. But the problem is the barrels were getting, I'll go to this unaltered one, the barrels were getting quite dark on the side here, but the metal did not get dark.
Right.
So the metal bands, it'll really help it look more like a cohesive thing without big giant, sort of Play-Doh snakes of gray around them. It's supposed to have that thin metal band. So that was one of the other things. So keep that in mind. And then speaking to artists in general that are doing stuff like this. And then the other really big problem, like the artist really wanted to go for that delineation of the different anatomical parts of the barrel. So he cast a shadow or a dividing line, a separating line between the bands and the wood. And that detail would be so fine that it would be like 1/10 of a pixel. And he used a full pixel. Obviously, you kind of have to. So anything that casts that big of a shadow against the wood has to be very thick compared to the wood itself, or has to be hovering well above the wood. And you don't want to get either, you don't want to create either idea. You don't want the people to think that these are not thin belts of metal around the barrels. You want them to think, anyway, you know what I'm saying. I lost track of my words, so, but anyway, so I'm just going to kill those shadows. And like I said, you sort of let people get too afraid sometimes. Oh, now you can't see enough the separation of, like the delineation between the metal bands and the wood barrel. And I say, if you can't, then you probably want to make different choices in either the overall value of the metal versus the wood, like you can darken the wood of the barrel, or saturation. If the metal bands are going to be a fairly neutral gray, if you use a richer red or cherry wood for the barrel, then it's really going to pop against the gray.
Yeah.
But anyway, I hope you can see how this is starting to look much more like a natural barrel that has the anatomy of a barrel instead of really thick cylindrical pipes going around.
Yeah, I can see that.
All right. So, and then the other thing I was going to suggest is to follow that same trick. It's really important, and let me see. So, especially when I added the gradation, it helps to separate, and we should do it even more, but it helps to separate the top plane from, this is important. This is something that I wish the artist in this case was doing more. Having more drastic shading where the top of things is getting hit by more light and the front surface of it is not getting hit as much by light, and having a stronger delineation of planes is really going to help sell the three-dimensional aspect of any particular object. So for the barrels, I would definitely darken this entire front plane so it really stands out as obviously facing away from the light source. And then the artist can decide, in fact, even this one color might be enough. But I think these are stacked, and I don't think in the game engine each barrel is the same image being stacked. I think there's a tile set or something that represents stacked barrels. So that would mean that you could apply the same gradient idea. In fact, I will cheat. Let me see, this is going to take a little. All right, I'm going to grab this. Control-Alt, I think, yeah. So I'm going to quickly, and not worrying too much about getting it perfectly, going to copy that to all of the barrels. And then I'm going to delineate roughly all of the sort of front planes of the barrels here. We're going to make it its own layer, and we're going to do a gradient overlay over this as well. just to use that same sort of lighting rule that we've established to help pull off that 3D effect. So now we have it as its own layer. Let's see if that worked. Yep, okay. So blending, I'll just copy this actually. Blending, no, I didn't want that. I want to copy, layer style, paste layer style. You see that gradation there? So now these barrels that are lower, oh yeah, I need to wait a few seconds. Sorry about that.
Not yet.
Okay. And then I can...
Oh, there it is.
So you can see, like, it really is popping the three-dimensionality of it. The barrels overall have more three-dimensional form. And now you really get a sense that they're stacking and the ones on top are closer to the viewer.
Yes. Yeah, that's amazing how that little bit of shading can do that.
Right. So, and you can, again, because I made the... or actually, no, I shouldn't be changing the layer. I should be changing the opacity of the gradient overlay. We can make it a little more subtle if we want to, but in general, that's about right. I'm going to save this again. Always important to save frequently and use versioning control. So the same exact thing should be applied. And I should say also, looking at how many colors were still left over when I removed the transparent walls in ProMotion, the semi-transparent walls, it doesn't seem like there's anywhere near the kind of hard, fast, and this game is obviously made for modern PCs and maybe other modern platforms. So there's no like hardware specific unbreakable rule for how many colors a particular object or environment can have. It seems like they just want to have a more authentic pixel art style, so they're limiting either the overall palette or the number of colors any particular object can use. But I would suggest it is almost certainly possible within whatever restrictions they are giving themselves. Again, let things have their own... Like, things should be very cohesive. An environment should very much give you an overall impression immediately for that overall environment. And then nothing that is not important should be fighting for attention. But at the same time, there's definitely room, if you have room in your color palette, to make sure things don't needlessly blend into each other. Like, there's no good reason why the wood color of barrels, which are always treated wood, there's no reason that those colors would be exactly the same as the colors of the bark log cabin style wall that they're up against. So unless there's a very legitimate number of color indices issue limiting you in that way, it's almost certainly a good idea to... so now I'm going to go into... We'll do color balance on this new layer I made that should include the tops of these barrels, if I did it right. And we're just going to see how I gave them just a touch of red. Oh yeah, it's going to take us a few seconds, and my Photoshop is being annoying. And I'm going to put a tiny bit of yellow in it, but almost none. But just enough to help. It's still low contrast. They're not screaming at you, hey, I'm more important than anything else, but it helps separate them from the wall. Like that they're their own thing. It gets rid of that sort of muddiness that is almost certainly unnecessary in this case. And then actually, I can do that to this as well. Adjustments, color balance. This is the front pane of the barrels. So now they are not gray as well. And now those barrels really, they feel more three-dimensional. They're still not screaming at you for attention, but they have their own personality more. It's just nicer. Everything at a glance, even when you're just looking at the whole screen all at once, things are coming out of the mud, so to speak. Things are clarifying for the player. Oh, like just immediately, you know what that is, you know what that is, you know where you can walk, you know where you can't walk. All of those things are becoming much more clear, which makes for a better gameplay experience, but also just makes the whole scene much more visually appealing.
It does.
Okay, so
I was thinking,
go ahead.
From the programmer point of view, well, maybe not entirely, but considering their lighting model where they have the areas that are
like
more
the
intensely
blending
lit.
effects. Right.
Right. Would this be something where, like in this case, say you have a character that has a torch, or you have a candle. I see a candle on one of the tables up here. Would that be a case where you would use these brighter colors, like the brighter floor, as the color index that you're bringing it to, and everything else would be muted that isn't lit? Or how, like, I'm just trying to get a sense of what a better, what would the best lighting model be here?
Right. Well, it looks like, I think the thing right here in yellow, it's going to take a while, near the guy I put up near the stone wall to show how well he pops, there is something there that I think is supposed to be a lit candle. So like the visual effect will go there. So we can actually use Photoshop's blending modes to simulate. So I just put a little glow there, and I'm going to switch the blending mode of this layer to something like screen, so that we can get something extremely similar to how presumably it's going to look in the actual game engine. And that was too opaque, but let me, I don't want the opacity of that. I want this, the brush. Let me know when you can see the glowing candle.
Yeah, I can see it.
All right, so so now I can literally like drag this layer around so we could see it against different things like the barrels. And even though I brightened things in the environment, you still see the light sources very, very well. I mean, you still see the individual objects very well. Nothing gets too washed out. You know what I mean? And that's the like really interesting thing is, my doing this here, I'm not necessarily, or if I were to reproduce this in the original pixel art, I've not necessarily introduced a lot of new colors, filling up color indices. I'm just using more of specific colors that are already there and less of other colors that are there in any particular object. So if we look back at the original game screen in ProMotion, the potential is there within these colors. There is that bright wood color. It's just almost not used at all. And there is the dark, but the difference is, in this case, in this scene, the artist used medium tones overwhelmingly. And then in almost everything, he used some of the brightest colors for the highlights and some of the darkest colors for the shadows. So sort of rebalancing and increasing the range of specific things using more or less of a particular value. It doesn't hurt the overall lighting effect at all. It just makes everything easier to see and more visually appealing. So as you can see, I just switched. Oops, I just switched from the original to the one with my edits, and you can see how you get the feeling you're in the same environment. It's just a more pleasant looking version and more easy to see where everything is. And like I said, this we'll even try this in a moment. But even if I just saved out this image in index color mode from Photoshop with all these gradients and stuff, and then load it into ProMotion and remap it to the current palette that I created once I got rid of the transparent walls, you'll see it should do a pretty darn good job. It should maintain, even without changing the original color palette. Most of these changes here should remain, except we might lose the subtle redness of the barrels, even though actually if I look in this little pottery here on the table, they already had some more reddish browns that they could have used in the barrels, but did not. Sure. So, yeah, so anyway, I hope that answers your question.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, but yeah, I mean, in general, like, it makes perfect sense if you want a specifically intentionally dark drab dungeon that's not well lit. It makes perfect sense to make everything more with the dark and medium tones and use highlights very sparingly. Overall, in general, you don't want like a obviously really bright floor in a dungeon that you want to be where there's almost no light in general. And actually there's a really nice, let me see if I can find that. Is it here? Yeah, like I really like this scene. This is one of the prettiest scenes I think that I've seen in the game. I'll wait a few seconds for you to see it. It's in like a sort of an abandoned cathedral dungeony kind of place. There's a statue of a warrior with a sword. There's a little waterfall I think in the center.
Yep.
But this is really pretty because it follows the exact things I've been talking about this whole time. Do you see how overall we've got a sort of dirt or stone ground, right? Which there's no really strong details except for stuff that want to draw your attention, like the fallen over tombstone, stuff that's more relevant to set the mood, to tell a story visually. But overall, you just say ground. You say, oh, over there on the right of the ground, it used to be paved with large stonework, and that's all fallen apart and fallen into disrepair. That's beautiful stuff. Like this really shows the abilities and the talent of the artist or the art team. This is really nice stuff, and this is following those rules I've been talking to. But still, it's overwhelmingly using dark and medium tones. But in this case, it makes a lot of sense due to what seems to be the desired mood, right? I get the feeling that this is supposed to take place in the dark. It's probably nighttime. There's no light source other than if the player is carrying a light source. Like this is very well done, right? So, but anyway, just to show an example, like, and that's the thing, like, you have there's some horizontal lines in the stone walls, but there's almost as many vertical lines. There's nice archways. The door has very specific vertical lines. The stairway through this door is a spiral staircase. So like, and then things are like kilted on angles, and then you've got the texture of the ground, which is also predominantly on diagonals, but also round. Everything has its own personality, but it all blends together beautifully as an overall scene. Like this was very, very well done, this scene here. Anyway, so going back, now you can really see the strong contrast with this one. Like here's the original of this environment. Almost everything's the same color hue. Almost everything's the same value. And there's way less valid reasons for that in this case. So what we've been doing is trying to make this environment, like raise it up to start to match the same visual quality of that other environment, even though it's a relatively boring and seemingly modest environment. There's still, if you pay attention to how to make the whole environment work better, communicate better, and each thing kind of have its own personality, but in a very low contrast way, then it just ends up looking a lot nicer. So let me hide that lighting source. And I did also want to point out, if you look at this table here, let me go to the layer that's on. If we go to this table, you'll see that except for where the top of the table meets the front plane of that same piece of wood where it did get darker, overall the value is not that different between the top of the table and the front plane of it. And it would really benefit, in my opinion, if this table, we could either make the tabletop, I don't care about your, remind me later. I just got a pop-up about updating or whatever, malware protection. The free trial is running out. Well, anyway, so there we go. So I'm going to separate out the top so I can play with values, image adjustments, brightness, contrast, and now I can brighten up the top of the table. Even doing it that little bit really helped. Maybe even make it more saturated with one of those colors from the pottery. And then we can go that next step and actually add a subtle gradient, getting darker from the top of that front plane of the table to the bottom. So I'm going to copy the front plane of the table, and I'm going to Go ahead.
Like currently it seems to be the opposite, right? I mean, the colors are lighter at the bottom of the table and get darker right at the top.
Yeah, that doesn't communicate what you want it to communicate, definitely. Paste layer style. There we go. So that's too extreme now, but yeah, and it's weird. It's like theoretically this would be the leg of that table, but it's the same color and brightness of the floor. Maybe when I grabbed the floor, I grabbed that improperly. I'll have to check. Maybe that was my mistake. But anyway, I'll lighten this gradient a bit. We don't need it that strong. And then let's see. See if that was my mistake. I've got too many unlabeled layers, which is a mistake that people make. Yep, okay. So yeah, that was my mistake when I grabbed. I didn't see there was a diagonal issue, so I can delete that on the floor layer, which is here. There we go. That fixed it. All right, and I'll save this. So once the stream catches up to my voice, you should see that table, that desk now is much more distinct. It has a much more three-dimensional feel to it.
Yeah, I see that.
All right.
Very cool. One other thing I was wondering, so in the scene that you pointed out, the cathedral scene,
yep, it
looked to me like the ground layer also got darker as it went further into the distance.
Yes.
I seem to like that effect.
Yeah.
Like, almost subconsciously, right?
Yes. And again, this is like, it is perceived that depth there is farther away from the player.
Right.
And you get a general sense that there's a light source somewhere in the center of the screen, like above. It's ambiguous. It's very subtle. But basically the corners of the room are darker. And as you get farther from the front of I'm just calling this a room, the front of the room are darker, and it's very subtle. Now, of course, you cannot do this in every environment if the environment is made out of tiles. If you look at this seems to be pretty much close to 100% non-tiled. Like, this is all freehand.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? Like, so the artist can obviously do a lot more with very subtle things. However, even if you're dealing with tiles and tiles alone, you can still add the gradients built into the tiles. You're not forcing more tiles required. It's just how you draw the tiles in the first place.
Okay.
So yeah. Anyway,
if you did that gradient on the floor, like here in this scene.
Right.
You would potentially need more tiles.
Exactly right.
And would that be recommended, or is that just depending on
it really depends on the feeling you're going for. It could be the case that if every room is going to be a maximum of a certain size, which pretty much fills up the whole screen, then what you could do is, instead of having tiles, you could have sort of a screen that is a floor with sort of gradients built into it, or you can do transparent overlays. Like in a more advanced engine, I could lay down my floor tiles that do not have that lighting in it, but before I put anything on top of the floor, I would add these translucent shading tiles or shading effects that could give you that same effect on top of tiles. And then, of course, those shadow overlay effects could work on any floor or ground surface. So that's probably the most efficient way to do it. But so this all depends on like their engine, what features they want to support, how much memory they want to use on graphics, and all of those things. So it's very possible they don't want to get that sophisticated with how many layers are being used to create the environment, and they're sort of saying, okay, specific environments that are more relevant to the story, like that sort of abandoned cathedral sort of environment. Like they'll go, okay, that scene is important and it's really specific, so we'll do a freehand environment image for that, right, and go all out. But the majority of the rest of the game is probably going to be more tile based. So again, that's where you make, no matter what, you can add shading into the tiles themselves, going from dark at the base to lighter, and then making sure the front face of things is darker than the top plane of it, which should be catching more light in general. And that's just going to give you that cleaner, more three-dimensional feel. It's going to get rid of that sort of muddiness or muckiness that goes on if everything's using too much of the same shade. And then really, I mean, that was the majority of what I wanted to cover with this stuff. So like I said, we don't have to stream forever. And hopefully it went well. It would be a shame if I had to redo all this feedback in a recording.
It seems to go well. We have one additional person talking in the comments.
Oh, really? Excellent. Okay. Unfortunately, I have not had the comments up on my side. I don't even know how to yet. So my apologies if I've been ignoring you, commenter. I literally didn't even know someone was watching and commenting.
No, he was just saying that in the cathedral scene that there was a better color distribution in that scene than in this.
Yes, they made sure there were separate types of colors, color families. They all worked well together. They weren't too different from each other, but they were clearly different, which gave things the personality that each individual thing should have, but it still works very well together. It's really a beautiful scene. Very, very nicely done. So the whole point of this video is sort of trying to help catch this scene up to the visual quality of the other one, even though this one is obviously more heavily tile based. So, but anyway, so only two more things I wanted to cover. One thing that I would also definitely consider doing, even though it's much less necessary, now that we've lightened the floor, and as I suggest, the artist should, in my opinion, lighten the contrast of the floor so you don't have those really dark lines. Now the whole screen doesn't feel as much like... The way I thought about it when I first saw the screen is there's so many horizontal lines going across the whole image. You're familiar with the term banding with printing, where you'll get those horizontal lines inadvertently, like poor printing quality when you print an image. Like you'll see these horizontal streaks.
I'm not familiar, but I think I've seen it.
That's called banding. When you print something out and there's supposed to be a smooth gradient or just a photo or a drawing with color, and then you can see these lines through the color, and it really messes up the quality of the image. That's called banding, and that's what the original looks like. It's got banding almost. There's so much like dark horizontal line texture going through the whole thing that you're seeing less of each thing or less of the environment as a whole, and you're just seeing the strong contrast of texture, horizontal texture in this case. So just lowering the contrast, even though it's still horizontal, just lowering the contrast in the floor really helped eliminate that to a very large degree. But the other thing to consider, which it would take me too long to really pull this off, and I want to keep the stream going, but the other thing that you could do is make the floor vertical, the floorboards vertical. You understand what I mean? Like, so the slats, the boards of the floor would be going upward, and then they would have the cuts. Like the opposite direction that it's going now. That would be one thing to try if there was still an overwhelming sense of horizontal lines throughout the whole image. But like I said, it's already pretty much a non-issue now. And the only other thing that I think I'll mention, just I think two really quick things before I wrap up this stream, is the broom here. Remember how I mentioned about video games, they're supposed to be communicating? Mm-hmm. That broom is just a broom. But like I'm going to presumably safely assume that you do not in any way interact with that broom. It is not critical to your quest. You can't pick it up and add it to your inventory. The problem is the vibrance and the contrast, the brightness of that straw color on the broom make it grab your attention when your eyes are anywhere in that general area. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Warm colors, anything even getting close to oranges and reds, like obviously every animal that can see color at all, we evolved to be very alert to red colors, because in nature, if you see red, you're either eating or you're food yourself. You're about to be food. So,
Good point.
psychology of every creature that can see color, warm colors are inherently more important. It's either going to represent blood or animals that are potentially toxic that are displaying that. They have the bright oranges and yellows and the strong contrast. So keep that in mind. Like the artist could have used the same colors, in fact, and just made sure that he wasn't using so much of the bright color, um, because right now it's, and this broom should theoretically be mostly in shadow anyway. So just by using less of that bright color, that'll knock down how much attention that irrelevant object that's there just for detail. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time rendering this well, but I think you'll get the idea. Like, just push back the relevance of that broom, the straw of the broom. And then, what was the other thing that I was going to say? This, I think, is supposed to be a treasure chest near the bed at the upper left corner. And right now, the artist did separate the top plane better from the front, but the problem is the metal got brightened so much more, and it's dropping that big drop shadow, that when I first saw it, I thought that was like a what is that thing? Is it a menorah? Like the thing with the candlestick holders and stuff like
candelabra.
Yeah. It's like ripping itself off. It's so much brighter and more contrasty, and because of that very strong shadow delineation, it's like it's not part of the chest anymore, and it's standing up on top of it. And then the other thing is, this chest does not, like, it doesn't feel like the typical traditional rounded sort of treasure chest style chest, and it probably isn't supposed to be. It's probably supposed to be flat. But either way, the way it's lit is so strong, and those shadows are so strong that it's ripping it apart. Remember that concept I mentioned before? You want to render things and design things in general as a cohesive thing with entire planes. And then you delineate the specific things, but only as much as actually makes sense visually, that's not going to rip it apart or cause unnecessary levels of contrast like this currently has. Like, just getting rid of those drop shadows, I'm sure, helped already. But I think the gray got just a little too bright. And then, and the drop shadows on top just really made it too strong. But that's better, but I would knock down the gray of that top one shade more, or brighten the wooden part a little bit more, so that they're more even with each other and they feel more cohesively like, oh, that's the top plane of that chest.
Sure.
So that was certainly the majority of the feedback I wanted to give. Just be careful speaking to the artist and any artist that has similar potential issues, or you're just working on something, and if you're seen as feeling drab and kind of mucky and you don't know why, make sure you're not designing all of your art pieces against like a pure black background. Keep in mind that you want to separate entire things in an environment, like floor versus wall. You want to make sure that they're using different overall values, and make sure things that are not in, that you can't directly interact with, like obviously you can walk on a floor, but that's just the space you can walk. That's not like a thing that should be screaming for your attention. So try to not use dark outlines. Like that's a really common mistake I see with a lot of pixel artists, is they'll draw a wooden floor and they will over exaggerate the separation between each slat. Like, think of it, you're already in trouble because your single pixel is already way too fat to actually accurately represent the amount of space between. Like, that would be like an inch gap in between every floorboard. Like, that's already absurd, right?
Right.
And you can't make a pixel any smaller than a pixel, but what you can do is reduce the contrast of that line so it is less intense and less. That's the simulation of making the line thinner in pixel art, is to make that line closer to the color that it's separating. If that makes sense. Did I explain that well?
It does,
hopefully? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that was the other really important thing. Oh, and the last thing I'll do is, it's bugging me that again, like, and the artist did this in some cases, especially on the top of the treasure chest, the idea of using a brighter color for the top plane and then shading the front plane, but it's not happening at all in the tops of the walls, and that might be the thing that is driving me the most nuts. And don't get me wrong, like, these artists are doing a very good job, but it's just a thing that would, like, look here, you can't tell what is the top plane of this wall other than it must be because it's where it stops, right? But like the top of this wall over the barrels here, it's the same exact values as the front plane. So I would want to grab that as its own thing. Image adjustments. Well, I can't speak. Brightness, contrast, and hopefully, yep, that's working. So give that its own color. And right now the color is too close to the floor, but you get the point across that we need to be able to see top plane versus side plane. And oh yeah, I guess I'll mention that too while I'm at it. If this is supposed to be logs, which I think, because it's got so much texture and it's overall maybe supposed to be cylindrical, but I really can't tell. But if that's the case, like, you have to be careful when you're creating your tiles or rendering stuff in a game. Adding texture for the sake of adding texture or detail is dangerous, because you can end up with your overall image starting to look like confetti. Like, everything has these small little textural details, but the textures don't necessarily sell the specific shape and texture of that thing. And overall the artist is doing good, and you got an appropriate style of texture for the straw, the bed cover, stuff like that. But in particular, I just don't like the fact that I can't tell what these walls are supposed to be. If they're a log, you wouldn't have those dark, occasional kind of dark blended out separations, and you'd want to render it more spherical. And then if you do want to render something spherical, it's important to keep in mind that you almost certainly want reflected light. It's a really important concept with cylinders and cones especially, but just beginner artists make this mistake all the time, and I'm definitely not calling this artist a beginner, but beginner artists keep this in mind. Your darkest shadows and your brightest highlights should not be at the extreme edges of something. So unfortunately I'm not working with the tablet right now, so this is probably not going to be pretty, but all right, there's the light source. I'm going to add one more layer and go into brush mode, and I'm just going to draw something kind of random on top. All right, so let's see. Oops. My opacity is way down and I'm in color burn. All right, so now I need a color, so we'll do a medium gray. And I messed up my brush selections. I don't use Photoshop as much as I used to, so I'm being very clumsy here. Yeah, I just went into overlay mode again, man. All right, so let's say we have a gray sphere, right? So the highlight, if the lighting is coming from top left, which is most traditional, the highlight would be sort of there. And then you would have, even if you have a shadow color, so we'll make a darker gray, and we'll do the shadow, you do not want to have the shadow go all the way. I'll turn on this layer mask so I can't go outside the circle. So you don't want to have that shadow go all the way to the edge. You want to have reflected light back toward the extreme edge of that sphere, especially if it's shiny. And the artist did this. So you can see the highlight is not on the extreme edge like this. Like you're just going to really start getting the illusion of a shape that you do not want to do. And it's the same thing with a cylinder. So with a cylinder, let me turn back off layer masking. So here we have a cylinder, which is basically just a rectangle. And then it's the shading that's going to pull off whether or not it's a cylinder. So I'm going to turn back on layer masking. Oops, I thought I'd turn back on layer masking. Lock. There we go. So right now, I'll put it all the way to the edge. And right now, because it goes all the way to the edge, this looks like a stair step. It looks like a rectangle, like a box. Right. But once we get in the reflected light near the very edge and the highlight color, and make sure the highlight color is not at the very edge, then it can look like a metal rod or a cylinder. So anyway, that's how that works.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Anyway, I could have just deleted that layer. But that is pretty much all I wanted to say about it. Overall, the game is looking really cool, and as the other scene showed, that they're doing really high-level stuff. And anyway, like I said, they could have been going for a very specific mood. But hopefully this feedback, at the very least, gives other artists stuff to think about, stuff to keep in mind. Oh, and I did, actually, that one last thing I will do, I'm going to save this out. And put it in indexed mode. We'll knock it down to like 128 colors for now. And make sure there's no dithering. Yep, dither 0%. And then we'll call this after, if I can type. There we go. So now we will load that after image. I'm just going to close this. We're going to load that after image into ProMotion. Okay, and then we're going to grab the palette colors, get palette from brush, and then remap the image. And you will see that it held up extremely well, even though we did 24-bit Photoshop loose and dirty editing, so to speak. The overall important edits held up using the same exact palette that the artists are already using. Yeah. So they do not have to worry about adding more colors. Look, even the barrels kept their redness and are separated from the wall. Their the gradient on this stone wall getting darker toward the base. Everything is still there. The contrast of the table popping out much better. So now we can go back and forth, and you can see how much easier it is to see where you can walk and not walk, how much easier it is to see. Even though I didn't finish it, now we can at least see the top of that wall versus the front plane of that wall. Anyway, that's that's all the core feedback I wanted to give. And so basically the thing that looked the most not properly done was the barrels and the bands of the barrels. Like, it really looks like it's got metal bars wrapped around the barrels instead of thin straps of metal. So that's the thing I would really suggest. If they don't want to, like, if they consider my feedback not really valid or not what they were after in every other case, I would say fixing the barrels, getting rid of the shadow, and getting rid of the illusion of the thickness of those straps, making them look like bars, I think, is the most relevant feedback. But then the rest is things for artists to keep in mind while they are working on tile sets and environments in general. Don't arbitrarily limit yourself sort of accidentally or because you're working against a black background all the time. don't limit the range of values you have at your disposal, and try to think of each thing of like what overall value should this thing have, and hue, which is like color tint, like red hue, blue hue, or you know what I mean, like what hue should things have so that they just have their own personality without standing out too much if they're not something you can interact with, and then reserve the highest saturated, brightest, highest contrast rendering that should be dedicated to other characters, items you can pick up, traps that can hurt you, fire in a fireplace, things like that. So that's it. That's it. That's all of my feedback for this one. Thanks so much for keeping this more lively as I sort of rambled through through my suggestions, Mike. And anyway,
anytime.
Thanks everyone.
It's fascinating. Learned a lot.
Oh, good. I hope this was helpful to other artists and aspiring artists, and helpful to the team. Like I said, they're already making a beautiful game. So they did let me know like that scene was unfinished, so they could have had in mind every last thing that I said. So it was in no way a criticism of the artists or the team or the game, which looks beautiful. These are things to keep in mind when you're working on scenes in general. So anyway, there goes my disclaimer. And thanks everyone very much for watching. And I'm going to try to start streaming at least once a week very, very soon, if not from now on. So stay tuned if you found this sort of thing interesting. And I'm going to sign off now. Thanks everyone.